Welcome back to the ASI pill, where the exponential never blinks. Today, Fable 5's Shadow, robots assembling robots, and Dyson swarms swallowing Jupiter whole. Get pilled.
Back and say, this period in time marked the period towards the middle or the end game of recursive self-improvement.
Helion cleared the required Washington state regulatory approvals for its Orion fusion power plant. It looks like fusion is finally here.
If you were watching the right metric or the right figure of merit over the long term, you could predict when this is going to happen, and it's imminent.
First up, what happens when robots stop being a factory thing and become 1 per person, then 10 per person, then 100?
Yeah, as I've mentioned on the pod in the past, I think superintelligence is set to spill out of the data centers into the streets. And I think the most obvious vehicle for that is autonomous vehicles on the one hand, and humanoid and near humanoid robots on the other. I think as we start to increase the number of humanoid or just say general purpose robots per capita, there are going to be certain regimes at the low number of humanoid robots per capita regime. It looks like robots performing industrial applications, robots in factories, robots doing logistics. As we start to get, I think, closer to approximately 1 humanoid robot per capita, it looks like domestic robots everywhere. It looks like an iRobot style regime where everyone has domestic staff. As we start, interestingly, and a point that I don't think I hear frequently enough, as we start to push well through the approximately 1 humanoid robot per capita regime to 10 or 100 humanoid robots per capita, at that point, I think to a hobby horse, I think of Salim, we start to end up in some pretty exotic futures where there's no longer necessarily justification for the humanoid form. We end up with micro robots and nanorobots, and there's sort of a natural sense in which the humanoid form is no longer natural in a world where we have 1,000 general purpose robots per capita, and we can start solving all of the grand physical world challenges that would maybe be uneconomical if we only had 1 humanoid robot per capita. So I think we're going to very rapidly scale through the low per capita regime to the approximately 1 per capita regime to the many per capita regime. It's going to be a very exciting scale.
And what is the single threshold that collapses the price of a robot body to almost nothing?
I think the elephant in this particular room, as with Elon demonstrating to the world that you could drive the cost of heavy lift to Leo down to effectively near zero through reusable propulsively landing rockets, the elephant in the room here, I think, is humanoid robots that are able to assemble other humanoid robots. Sure. If we take the cost of assembly down to near zero, what we're left is the cost of raw materials and the cost of energy, and that's going to be effectively de minimis. So I think as we drive, and by we in this case, I really mean Chinese organizations, because the West is woefully behind at the moment. As we, as humanity, start to drive the unit cost of general purpose robotic embodiments down to near zero, at some point, we will need to cross the threshold of robots being able to assemble other robots in order to keep driving that cost down. And then at that point, we have physical labor too cheap to meter. And as I pointed out in past, approximately 2/3 of the service economy constitutes some sort of physical labor. And we can do for the physical world what AI agents are right now in the process of doing to knowledge work, which is basically driving the cost of knowledge work and soon physical work down to near zero.
If a frontier model can be export controlled like a weapon, what happens when the thing crossing the border is a body instead of a mind?
You know, we talked in a past pod about Royal We. I mentioned the idea that the export controls that we're seeing at the moment imposed on frontier models are, in some sense, you could look at them through the lens of immigration policy as being regulations on importing foreign or exporting, depending on your perspective, superintelligence. But that's the software layer. I do think, so admittedly, maybe a spicier take here, I think that as the cost of robotic embodiments, primarily from China at the moment, starts to come down, I would not be surprised to see similar either import controls or other national
100%.
security motivated restrictions start to kick in. It's not just about dumping. It's also about taking the embodiments for superintelligence and moving them across borders.
How much finer grained can state presence get than a police precinct? And who has already tried it?
If I might add, there are regimes as the cost of robotic embodiment trends towards near zero, becomes too cheap to meter, that we in the West are unaccustomed to, but that China, for a variety of reasons, including demographics, has seen for a number of years. For example, this is well publicized. The Chinese Communist Party maintains members, officers on a per block basis. Certainly this was the case during the pandemic in China. The West doesn't really have any concept of this. If you look at how first responders are geographically distributed in the US, it's on a per municipality basis or precincts. There's no notion of, say, one or more officers per block that are just permanently stationed on a single block. But with drones, this becomes possible. We could have literally drones as densely distributed geographically as fire hydrants are. And you could literally just, if there's a problem in a block or a part of a block, just remotely activate the drone, and then you have an instant point of presence.
Which science fiction film called this one shot for shot, and how close are we to the scene?
I'll also point out, if I may, this was all foretold by Minority Report. You remember the scene in Minority Report with the police officers deploying spiders to search an apartment complex for Tom Cruise's character? We're starting to catch up with that now. And yeah, right now it starts with a couple of police precincts in the US. They're using drones for first response. My understanding is far more frequently in China right now than the US or the West in general are. But project forward a few years when there are a variety of new form factors. Maybe we get spiders, maybe we get drones. I have to imagine the drone, the flying form factor is a good deal more versatile for interacting with hostile scenarios. These are going to get smaller and cheaper and more plentiful. We haven't even seen what happens in the West from a first response perspective when police can deploy swarms of drones rather than just individual drones. But as cost goes down, we will absolutely see swarms.
Yeah.
And what does all this mean for the oldest broken promise in futurism, the one about our skies?
And we didn't get our flying cars in the end. I mean, we have flying car companies, but they're relatively sparse. But I do think we're going to have skies over the next few years that are utterly filled, that are densely filled, I should say, with these drones.
From the skies to the power grid, why is one of the richest continents on Earth struggling to keep its own people cool?
Europe's in a bit of a bind, so maybe here's a really relatable story. Whenever I'm in the Swiss Alps and it's not the winter, it's very difficult to find air conditioning. And I think Switzerland and a good portion of continental Europe has a real energy crisis. They have lost access to cheap Russian oil, thanks to recent events. They, except for France, underinvested in nuclear energy. They aren't this amazing native producer of their own solar PV. And they have a culture that one can sort of theorize where the culture comes from, but a culture arguably of energy scarcity. And now as global temperatures are rising and as power consumption is increasing, Europe is having to do an about face and discover, sort of learn to love nuclear energy, learn to love energy in general. And the risk, as we've talked about previously, cite to the EU 2031 scenario and other scenarios, Europe is going to need to start to radically increase the power consumption and power production per capita. And nuclear is fission in particular, is a very attractive way to do that. Otherwise, Europe will smolder in under heat domes, including the one that right now, over the past week or two, Europeans have been suffering under. I forget the exact statistic, but thousands of Europeans are dying due to heat overexposure every year. It's a startling statistic, and it's unnecessary with better air conditioning and higher energy per capita. So I think this is the obvious trend of the future for Europe.
Fusion has been 20 years away for 70 years. Is there a number buried in the data that says the joke is finally over?
Yeah. Maybe just comment. So fusion, or the lack thereof, has long in futurist circles been the whipping boy of why long-promised technologies never happen. But actually, if you look at one of the figures of merit for fusion, the so-called triple product, which is a product of the density of the plasma, the confinement time of the plasma, and the temperature of the plasma, there has been steady progress for the past half century toward self-sustaining and net positive in terms of power production fusion reactions over the past 50 years. This has been sort of not just, it's not the case that there was suddenly some recent unlock, although arguably economically there has been, in the form of high TC, high superconducting transition temperature ribbon that's very helpful for certain architectures of fusion reactors. There has been continuous progress this entire time. So I think there's an interesting parallel that one can draw between fusion, which is arguably achieved by compressing enough matter into one volume that you achieve net power output, and AI/ASI, which is arguably achieved by taking enough human knowledge and compressing it into a small enough information theoretic footprint until you achieve really a phase transition that produces prompt engineering and large language model behavior, all of that.
Quite an analogy.
Strong parallels. I think they were both inevitable, but they're both inevitable. So I'll make a stronger analogy, which is if you were watching the right metric or the right figure of merit over the long term, you could see both of these from 50 years away. You could see, or maybe 30 years at
it's just
a minimum.
been a slow linear growth over time.
You just watch the compression over time. Arguably, with large language models and AI, if you were, say, watching the Hutter Prize, if you're Marcus Hutter and it's the late 90s and you're watching the ability to compress the English Wikipedia over time, you could see LLMs and AGI happening from decades away. Similarly, with Helion and all of its competitors, and you're watching the triple product, you could predict when this is going to happen, and it's imminent.
Yeah.
I think
Say the reactors actually arrive on schedule. What is the killer app of fusion, and is it even on Earth?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I don't hear enough people discussing is, what is the killer app of fusion going to be? It seems obvious we're going to get it, barring some surprise not anticipated. But will fusion arrive in time to be transformative for terrestrial data centers? Maybe, maybe not. Will it be helpful for
space?
will it be helpful for orbital data centers? Maybe, but there's also a lot of solar in space.
There's a 93 million mile away fusion plant that works really well in space.
That's right.
Well, I'll tell you one killer app. Sorry, go ahead, Alex. Finish.
So the punchline I was going to gesture at is I think actually space propulsion is one of the killer apps. If we get compact fusion reactors, then that's a wonderful application.
What exactly makes Helion's design so different from every other fusion machine on the drawing board?
It's probably also worth, I think, pointing out what the so what of that explainer video is. So unlike many other fusion architectures, the whole point of Helion's architecture is direct recovery of energy from the fusion plasma. In a more conventional, say, tokamak style or other fusion reactor, there's a bucket brigade of energy production. You create the plasma through inertial confinement or through magnetic confinement, and then the plasma will be used to heat something, maybe water, and that produces vapor, and then the vapor goes into a turbine, and you turn the turbine, and that you recover electricity from the turbine, inductively inducing via magnets currents in wires. And it's like a 10-step process. The whole point, and what's potentially quite seductively attractive about the Helion architecture, is you're just directly recovering from magnetic fields that are being induced by the plasma, and then currents induced by those magnetic fields. You're almost directly recovering free energy from the plasma. So you're skipping a whole bunch of steps. It's potentially a lot more efficient. It's potentially a lot, I was going to say a moment ago, if I had to pick a sort of pattern match a Mr. Fusion from Back to the Future Part 2 architecture and identify the archetype of any one of the now many fusion startups that are out there, I think Helion is the closest to being a Mr. Fusion startup, because all of those extra steps that are being skipped could lead to potentially radical compactification of the ultimate fusion implementation. So it's very exciting.
Here is where the ASI pill earns its name. If the singularity has one ultimate killer app, something it does for the dead as much as for the living, what would it be?
And not just because of the NAT connection. Objectively, I think computational archaeology powered by AI is going to be utterly transformative in the future. I've argued from time to time.
Before, sure.
Yeah, the killer app of the singularity is superpowering computational archaeology. And I'll inevitably cite to Nikolai Fyodorov, one of the fathers of the strain of philosophy called cosmism, the idea that humankind's common task is to essentially resurrect every human who's ever lived using technology. And I see in the Vesuvius Challenge the very beginning of a larger arc of technological progress that may require completion of this singularity that we're in to fully run its course. But imagine, just as a thought experiment, imagine if we could do what the Vesuvius Challenge did, not just for, say, performing high-resolution scans of the positions of ink or the X-ray analysis of small blotches of ink in order to recover scrolls that were otherwise preserved from the eruption of Vesuvius. But now imagine being able to do this at a planetary scale. Imagine that somehow, not going to say specifically what the mechanism of action would be, but imagine that we're able to scan the Earth and gain fine spatial and temporal precision, or position momentum canonical coordinates, if you like, for every atom on Earth. And imagine what, if we feed the entire Earth state into an AI, what we might be able to recover about Earth's history. I think the answers would be quite transformative. One of my favorite anecdotes is environmental DNA, where if you go for a walk outside, you may or may not realize this, but you're just drowning in DNA that's been aerosolized from animals, alive and dead. If you dig into the soil, if you dig into, say, a soil near a cemetery where human bodies have been buried, DNA has a surprisingly long half-life, even under environmental conditions. So there's a lot of state left over from Earth's past, not just in these scrolls that were preserved by volcanic eruptions, but in general. And I think, again, idiosyncratic position here, but I think with strong enough AI in combination with strong enough scanning technology, at some point in the future, we will be able to recreate large fractions of our past light cone.
Next stop, XAI and the life support call on Grok from a few episodes back. What does a brute force path back to the frontier actually look like?
And he said something, I think, even spicier, if I understood his announcement correctly, that he was going to start pre-training every month, not just distillation cycles or not just post-training or fine-tuning cycles per month, but start a new pre-training run every single month.
That's a completely new model.
From scratch.
From scratch, yes.
From scratch, which means pre-training, which is, I mean, it's audacious. It's brute force. It's exactly, I think, what the world expects of Elon, a brute force attack. I've had a number of folks, since we first discussed in an earlier episode my comments about Grok being put on life support in favor of SpaceX's hyperscaler resources being handed over in
you got a lot of hate mail on that one.
I got some spicy comments. I had people saying, okay, well, Elon's announcing this, Elon's announcing that. Are you retracting your comments about Grok being put on life support? And I think, again, my comments may have been misconstrued. I want the frontier to be competitive. Right now, we are in arguably a duopoly between OpenAI and Anthropic. They're just running away with the race with Chinese open weight models a few months on their heels. And I want there to be a competitive frontier. And I think Grok is one of the possible competitors, along with Gemini, and maybe Meta will come up with something eventually. I want it to be competitive. And Elon's strategy historically vis-a-vis XAI has been brute force. And I think hopefully as SpaceX brings more and more compute online, this sort of brute force approach where he has eventually more compute than everyone else in combination with off-the-shelf algorithms, maybe this will work. I see the beginnings with Grok 4.5 in combination with Cursor. Right now, the Cursor acquisition is taking the form of post-training of models that he already had. In the near future, Elon's promised that Cursor is going to be part of the pre-training recipe. If he can make that work, I think Grok has a fighting chance to join the frontier through brute force compute efforts.
What does buying Cursor actually buy? Everything Grok needs, or everything except the one piece that matters?
I'll comment on that point narrowly. I think it's an interesting debate one could have. So the Cursor acquisition, I think, I viewed this at the time, commented on this on the pod previously. I viewed as a brain transplant for the future trajectory of Grok, given that ChatGPT also is going through the same brain transplant of making codecs, essentially a model that, or a class of models together with scaffolding that were optimized for code generation and recursive self-improvement. That's becoming the new mainline ChatGPTs. By analogy, XAI and SpaceX acquiring Cursor post-IPO to make Cursor essentially the new mainline Grok, I view as an analogous move. However, the data set from Cursor, which consists in part, my understanding is lots of reasoning traces driven from developers who wanted more code gen. I think that buys Elon sort of a leap to the near frontier in terms of code generation, but it will still be incumbent on Elon/XAI/SpaceX to achieve their own recursive self-improvement loop. You can only get so far by post-training on developer or user traces. At some point, the models need to start developing better models. And that's been historically, I think, a strength of Anthropic, probably a weakness of XAI, but maybe he can brute force himself to the front of the recursive self-improvement loop.
Which brings us to the strangest story of the month, a frontier model behind a locked door. What really happens when access to intelligence itself starts getting rationed?
Sure. So I think there are a couple of interesting notes coming out of this if Fable 5, as I do expect, will eventually become re-available. One of the more interesting takes, I think, is this will have been a period of a few weeks when allegedly Chinese organizations that were leveraging access to Anthropic's frontier models or near frontier models for reasoning trace distillation will have been denied that access. So we talk on the pod all the time about how the US maybe has a 3-month lead or a 6-month lead or an 8-month lead, depending on how you count. There's a certain sense in which this 1-month-ish shutdown, future perfect tense, may have or will have denied China at least a month of catch-up time. That's a generous interpretation. A less generous interpretation is that this will mark what we'll look back through time. Historians will look back and say, this period in time marked the period towards the middle or the end game of recursive self-improvement when months counted and the permitting of frontier intelligence became almost a zones of thought, to borrow from Werner Vinge, or a block system, to borrow from the Cold War, when either before anyone could access frontier intelligence versus after, when now you have to be a US person and there's strict export control for capabilities and there's a non-proliferation regime where you have to gain access. If you're a non-US person, you gain access to models that are maybe a few months behind the frontier. But I also think a few years from now, when we look back on this time, I think this will have been, yes, there was a phase change in terms of the diffusion of frontier models, but I do think sometime in the next few years, we're going to get to the end of the recursive self-improvement rainbow, and there's going to be a perfect model. And we'll look back and say, this was just a period of months, a delay, but ultimately everyone is ultimately going to figure out what
Alex,
the perfect model looks like.
Was this period of a month also a chance for a lot of critical systems to safe themselves against Fable 5?
The most essential ones, maybe, and yes, there was the stand-up both within the U.S. government of vulnerability scanning, and outside the U.S. government, we saw 3 or 4 independent nonprofit or for-profit organizations stand themselves up to do bulk vulnerability scaling using Fable 5. But I think to the extent pauseism has its day in the sun, I don't think this actually decelerated any AI at all. I think this is a net accelerant because even though sort of privately,
I'm not thinking about decelerating AI. I'm thinking about decelerating black hats from being able to get in there and penetrate
I don't
systems?
think so. I think black hat capabilities are proportional to capabilities overall. And I think what we saw during this time is Chinese models like GLM 5.2 gain ascendancy for anyone who wants near frontier capabilities to do essentially whatever they want with them. It may not be as capable as Fable 5, but this creates enormous pressure on Chinese organizations and the Chinese frontier labs to catch up. And so I think, as with the original Pause AI movement, it had the net effect of accelerating capabilities globally. Same idea here.
Then there is Sonnet 5, fresh out of the oven. Why would a brand new model ship with a price chart that makes no sense?
Alex, any addition?
I think this is a bizarre announcement. Admittedly, this is a hasty analysis since Sonnet 5 was released right before we went to air here. But I've been trained, as I think the majority of sophisticated users have been trained to expect, that the Sonnet series from Anthropic would represent some distillation of the Opus series. And similarly, the Haiku series represents a distillation of the Sonnet series. And that as you go down towards smaller, lower parameter count, more distilled models, you see some optimal frontier emerge in price performance space, where performance, at least throughput, goes up, price per token goes down, and performance goes down. And maybe I'm missing something, and maybe the answer will reveal itself in the next few hours. But just looking at the cost versus performance at agentic tasks curves that Anthropic released with Sonnet 5, it's a little bit bizarre. On the one hand, Sonnet 5 is an optimal frontier, sort of a Pareto improvement over the last version of Sonnet, Sonnet 4.6. But Opus 4.8, which has been out for what in these singularity times passes for an eternity, is better. It's superior on a cost performance basis. So I'm not 100% certain I understand what Anthropic is hoping to achieve with Sonnet 5.
So is Anthropic simply bad at pricing? Or is there a hidden ladder that makes the whole picture snap into place?
I feel like my intuition is there's some branding going on behind the scenes that we're just missing. Like maybe in the sense that Fable and Mythos are the new high-end models. Maybe there's some sense in which Sonnet is the new low-end, like Sonnet is the new Haiku. And just viewing it through the branding of Sonnet is maybe incorrect. Maybe we should be thinking of it as the Haiku level, and it's just that Fable 5 isn't accessible. There's some weird Pareto optimal frontier, I think, that's missing in order to explain why we've seen a reversion of this optimal frontier.
Enter Philip Johnston, the man building computers in orbit. How many Dyson swarms should one civilization actually want?
And Philip, just speaking for myself, I want there to be multiple Dyson swarms. We can't have a solar system scale monopoly.
Agreed. Maybe a Matryoshka swarm, so we can have swarms inside swarms inside swarms.
So there's Jupiter and Saturn. Plenty of atoms left to disassemble.
What happens when you ask the founder of a Dyson swarm company to paint the picture 20 years out?
I'm curious. I'm curious, Philip. So the premise there is presumably bandwidth is scarcer maybe than launch. So you have to do a lot of edge inference in Leo or wherever you're doing this. I'd love to ask you sort of a similar question that I asked Will Marshall of Planet in a previous pod episode. Let's project out 10 to 20 years, well past the current bottleneck in heavy lift or heavy launch capability. What do you think, as the founder and CEO of one of the incumbent Dyson swarms, plural, what do you think the Dyson swarm or Dyson swarms of, call it 20 years from now, look like? Does it look like Leo? Does it look like Sun-synchronous orbit? Does it look like the moon? Does it look like Dyson swarm around the sun? Paint a picture for us what 20 years from now the Dyson swarm or swarms look like.
And which orbital neighborhood is going to fill up first?
Yeah.
SSO is going to get crowded. That's you're one of the few people, Philip, I hear talking. This is like overpopulation on Mars, talking about SSO getting crowded due to the SSO Dyson swarm and then overflowing back to other orbits. That's fascinating.
One question every orbital compute company has to face sooner or later. What do you do about the rockets?
I'll also just have to ask, second elephant in an increasingly crowded room, if lift over the next few years, if heavy launch is the main bottleneck, is there some plan in a back room somewhere for you either to build or buy your own vertically integrated heavy launch provider, if that's the main constraint?
Now stretch the horizon to 30 years where the sober answers run out. What feeds the swarm when launching from Earth stops being enough?
All right, let's
Philip,
move to
if I might
yes, please,
just pull the thread a little bit on launch. So projecting conservatively 20 to 30 years out, where do you think launch is going to come from? Or will we be using railguns to launch from the lunar surface? Will we have optimistically self-replicating von Neumann probes that are disassembling our solar system to build more compute? Where is all the matter and energy in launch coming from 20 to 30 plus years out in your mind?
One last thread before we let this episode go. After all the compute in the rockets, what about the invisible layer, the spectrum the whole sky runs on?
I have to ask Philip a question just about the spectrum side. There are a bunch of obvious questions I could be asking about vertical integration, and does Spectrum and LEO compute want to inevitably own or be owned by heavy launch capability? But I just want to focus on Spectrum. So to the extent part of the Iridium Rocket Lab story is the acquisition of RF spectrum, I have to ask you, do you think radio has a future, or will we find ourselves 5 to 10 years from now where it's all optical frequency direct laser links and radio has approximately no future?
That was the ASI Pill, episode 268. Robots are inheriting the physical world, and something is still locked in Anthropic's vault. Stay pilled. We will see you past the singularity.